All right. And I have the two screen situation going on, but I think I can still see all of you, which is delightful. Um, and so tonight we're talking Too Many Years Lost in History. Biblical characters break their silence on their sexual assault. The first line of this is a reference to the hit Broadway musical Six, about the six wives of Henry VIII. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It is a good one. And you'll see as we go along, I'll share some of the modern midrash that I wrote as part of this project, that is giving the biblical characters the opportunity to reclaim their narratives, inspired by Six, the musical. So I would be remiss if we didn't start with just a trigger warning, that is pretty clear from the beginning of the program that we are going to be talking about sexual assault. And we'll be heavily rooted in our biblical text this evening. But we'll be exploring the at times unspoken reality of the stories we tell. Reality here in italics, because we could spend all 25 hours of this tikkun debating what is reality when it comes to our Torah text. So reality with a little asterisk attached. And for each of these characters, the goal here is to give them a voice that they otherwise didn't have. And you'll see that some of them have more voice than others, but we're going to carefully consider what they may have experienced while also not wanting to make assumptions about their experience. Far too often, interpretations are interpretations. They assume from one point of view. And that's also often the case that we see with sexual assault survivors, who they tell one side of the story, and that's the side of the story that hopefully we lift up. But far too often, other stories take over and speak over their stories and their narratives. And so tonight we'll be talking about the sexual assault encountered, as it is written in the text, through modern exegesis. And I want to invite you to bring your curiosity, bring your midrash writing, your enthusiasm for Jewish text, and also approach this with some compassion for yourself, and your own ability to engage with this difficult topic. Sexual assault is something that is not foreign to us in a modern context, unfortunately, and looking at it in the biblical lens can be challenging. So I encourage you to take care of yourself as best you can during this conversation. And so with that, just to give us a little bit of framing, throughout our Jewish texts, sexual intercourse and misconduct have been identified both implicitly and explicitly, and we'll see that in a few minutes. And with and without consent, the stories of both male and female characters in the text and their sexual encounters have often been told around them, with little to no dialogue of their own voice included. And one academic writes, "It should be no surprise that the violence of rape emerges in the biblical narrative, alongside every other form of evil." Think about that for a second. We see so much evil in our biblical text that, as much as we want to think our text is better than it, of course, alongside every other form of evil, we see the evil of sexual assault, of rape. And we'll see that the ancient world regards rape very differently from our present day understanding, which is one of the beauties and challenges of grappling with this text. And so as we look at this text, we're going to look at it from the modern lens. But we're also going to have to recognize the text in which the way in which it was written, the lens and the capacity that these stories were written and told. And using both of these pieces, think about how can we as modern readers, as modern learners, um, lift up the voices that may be silenced in the original text. So to get us started, can either share your answers in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute, I'll invite you to do so. Who do you think of when you think about biblical characters and sexual assault? Are there any that stand out to you? People you immediately think of? Dina, Dina, Dina. Yes, yes, and yes. Curious, are there any others? Noah. Yeah, Noah, a good one. Um, Hannah or Hannah, I see a hand up. Oh, disappeared. Bilha?
And
Yeah. Hannah, go for it.
oh, sorry, it was earlier for Noah
Oh,
before I realized you were reading the notes. Yeah.
yeah. Tamar and Judah. Yeah. Bilhah, Lot, Ruth, the visitors to Sodom, all the handmaidens in general, because power dynamics, absolutely. Yeah. All of these. Um, and I will say that of all of the ones that you have all named, only one of them was included in the six that I looked at originally, which tells us just how many there are. Um, and one thing that I think is really notable is that right off the bat, we had four people immediately say Dina, right? We think sexual assault, violence, rape, whatever word you want to use for it in our text, Dina is the first one we think of. Um, and then when you spend a little bit more time thinking about it, we see all of these additional answers. And yes, questionable if Ruth was actually assault, and Tamar and Judah, not definitely assault. This is where things get tricky, right? And so while we're not going to look at Ruth or Tamar and Judah this evening, we're going to look at a different Tamar. Um, it it's interesting to see in our biblical text when we have moments where it is extremely clear what happened, and the text actually tells us way more than I would have expected, and when there's a lot of reading between the lines that we have to do. And in this reading between the lines, um, it is important to remember where the story is coming from. And so Alice Bach, in a compilation of articles about women in the Hebrew Bible, she writes, the importance of recognizing the biblical narrator as a figure telling a slanted story has been undervalued. So think about that. The importance of recognizing the biblical narrator as a figure telling a slanted story has been undervalued. So when you pick up a newspaper article, you know that whatever newspaper you are picking up, there's some slant to it. Even though all of our modern news companies claim, oh, we're, you know, apolitical, we're middle ground, there's always a slant, right? And whether it's the entire newspaper or you know that whoever's byline that is, they might have their own slant, their own perspective. But we don't think about that when we think about our biblical text. But we have to, right? The biblical narrator wrote from a perspective. Whether you think that the Torah was written by God and handed to Moses, or written by Moses with God over his shoulder, or divinely inspired and written down by rabbis, there's a slant somewhere. And we're going to take a look at how that slant impacts our biblical stories and the way that we interpret um, the sexual assault that we read about. Um, so just taking a look in the chat, we are going to take a look at this at the House of David a little bit. Um, and we're not going to talk about Bathsheba specifically, but there's a lot of sexual misconduct in the House of David for sure. Um, and Charlie, I think it's very interesting to point out that when you think about the Book of Ruth, there are a lot of themes of rape culture. Um, and I think that's something that is underlying. It's not necessarily easy to explore or um, dive deeper into, um, but very interesting. Would you be able to share a link to the slides in the chat? Yes, I can. I'm going to stop sharing for a second though, so that I can more easily do that. Um, Not to mention that the Torah had to be written for human language for us to understand. Yeah. Um, so Danny wrote about the filtering through human language, and we are going to take a look at that to see um, how translation impacts our understanding of all of this as well. Um, so there is a link to the slides if you would like to follow along on your own. Um, and I'm also going to, once we get into our text in a moment, I'm going to share a link to a Safaria sheet just so you all have it, but the text will all be also on the screen. Just so you can choose your own adventure for how you like to receive your text. So, who are we going to talk about this evening? Great question. I'm so glad you all asked. We are going to start with Joseph, um, taking a look at Genesis 39 and Joseph's encounter with Potiphar's wife. Um, and then we're going to continue with Dinah, going back a few chapters in Genesis, but you'll understand why we're going backwards in a moment. And then we're going to look at Tamar from 2 Samuel. So there are two Tamars in our biblical text, both of whom have sexual encounters that are notable. But we're going to look at Tamar in 2 Samuel, who is in the house of David. And we're going to look specifically at how the stories of both Dinah and Tamar reflect each other in some surprising ways. So we're going to start with the story of Joseph. And I'll just ask you to share either aloud or in the chat. What do we know about Joseph? Levirate marriage is pretty dodgy. Yes, that is an accurate statement. Yeah, Vashti and Esther and the whole story of Purim, really. Yeah, if this was a Purim evening of study, we would have gone a very different direction. But so what do we know about Joseph? So Emmett subscribes to the theory that Joseph is autistic. He's pretty socially awkward, and this episode is part of that. Okay, interesting. Emmett, if I forget, let's make sure we come back to that because I think that's the socially awkward piece is something interesting to think about. He was handsome. Yes, he would not be seduced. What do we know about him in general? He's a dreamer. He got sent to Egypt by his brothers. Yeah, sold into slavery. He had a coat. The coat had many colors. It's actually more of a garment, but he has a garment of many colors. Um, he was his father's favorite child. Rapidly moved up in the world and became Pharaoh's second in command. Robert says he has a certain level of arrogance. Was a boss at managing food to prepare for famine. Yeah. And that connects to the dreamer and dream interpreter, that he knew a famine was coming. Um, more is intellectually mature than emotionally. First economist. I've never heard that interpretation, but I kind of like it. I think it's an interesting approach. Yeah. And we know that his family has kind of cast him out, or his brothers at least. And so this part of our story finds him in Egypt. Um, and he is working as a slave in Potiphar's house. Um, and he's going to have an interaction with Potiphar's wife, which will lead him to some challenges. Um, and when his brothers eventually come to Egypt, he does pull some interesting tricks on his brothers when they don't recognize him. So there's a little bit of a chip on his shoulder for what they did to him, I would say. Definitely some feelings to be worked out. Maybe a need for some family therapy to work through some things. Um, but instead of family therapy, we get Pharaoh's household. So we'll take what we can get. So we are going to look at Genesis 39, verses 1 through 10. And there is a link to the source sheet on Sepharia. And the source sheet on Sepharia just has the bolded text on it. It does not have the full story. Um, and so I'm wondering if there's anyone willing to read for us. Um, just a couple of verses here. I know it looks like a lot. Just to give us a little context.
When Joseph was taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, a courier of Pharaoh and his prefect, a type of German or Egyptian official, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Almighty was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Eternal was with him and that the Eternal lent success to everything he undertook, he took a liking to Joseph. He made him his personal attendant and put him in charge of his household, placing in his hands all that he owned. And from the time that the Egyptian put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Eternal blessed his house for Joseph's sake, so that the blessing of the Eternal was upon everything that he owned, in the house and outside. He left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and with him there he paid attention to nothing save the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome.
Awesome. I'm going to
After
pause you right there for a second. If that's okay. Thank you so much. So Joseph's got a pretty good life here, right? He's in the house of Potiphar, but he's doing pretty well for himself. He is having success. His boss likes him. He is being given responsibility, and he is trusted, which is pretty big given that he is a non-Egyptian. Yes, he's still a slave, but he's a slave who's doing pretty well for himself. And he is well built and handsome. Seems like things are going maybe even a little bit better for him than they were when his brothers pushed him into a pit. Would you like to continue for us?
After a time, his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. He said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master gives me no thought to anything in this house, and all that he owns he has placed in my hands. He wields no more authority in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except yourself, since you are his wife. How then could I do this most wicked thing, a sin before God?" And much as she coaxed Joseph day after day, he did not yield to her request to lie beside her, to be with her.
Thank you. So, what do we learn about Joseph in relation to Potiphar's wife. And what do we know about Potiphar's wife? Again, you can share either out loud or in the chat. He is loyal. She is not. No. Yeah, he really recognizes all that his master has done for him, um, and doesn't want to mess up what he has going for him. And I want to also point out that there's a lot of underlying God stuff happening here. And I say underlying because it's God is with him, and God lent success to everything he undertook. But Joseph was a successful man. It says Joseph was a successful man. Joseph stayed in the house of his Egyptian master, and Joseph's master took a liking to him. He was put in charge of the household and given all of this trust. But he was given this trust because the master saw that God was with him. And knowing that God is with him, Joseph then says, "How could I do this most wicked thing and sin before God?" So that's a little surprising for our biblical characters at this point, especially when we think about how Joseph is likely the lone Israelite in this Egyptian household. There were probably a couple other, I mean, there were probably a lot of other slaves, but there probably were not a lot of Israelite slaves. And here he is recognizing not wanting to do something wrong in the eyes of God, which is interesting and not necessarily to be expected. And on the other hand, we're seeing this dichotomy with Potiphar's wife, who, as Adrian said, she's neglected by her husband, and she is trying to seduce him, right? Lie with me, be with me. And he's saying no. Maybe he's trying to let her down easy. Absolutely. Um, and why might he be wanting to let her down easy? He's maybe protecting himself and her from what would happen if Potiphar were to find out. hmm Power dynamics. Yes. Yeah. So by letting her down easy, he is not only protecting himself in the eyes of God, but also maybe protecting himself in the eyes of his master and the job and the good life that he has right now. It isn't clear from the text that he found her beautiful, so perhaps it was easier for him to hold his moral ground in that case. Yeah, I'll say the commentaries have a lot to say about this text. They have a lot to say about a lot of texts, but about how Potiphar's wife is perceived here. Um, but you're right that it just the biblical text itself doesn't tell us anything about her. Um, and it tells us that he is well built and handsome. Um, Adrian says he's young, spoiled, pretty boy, also quite politically adept, very smooth. Absolutely. Right? He's not gonna be dumb, for lack of a better word, and throw out what he has for this woman who we don't even know, and we don't know anything about her. We don't know if she is attractive. We don't know if they have a connection. We just know that he is maintaining his no. What happens next? One such day, he came into the house to do his work, none of the household being there inside. I'll say. The rabbi's really hammering on this. of if he knew that she wanted to seduce him, why would he go when no one else was there? There are a lot of different reasons and arguments. One is that it was an Egyptian holiday, and so he assumed everyone else was out observing this holiday, including her. Um, Another is that he made a mistake and like wasn't thinking. Lots of arguments for why he walked into this. Because then she caught hold of him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. So just to set the scene for us, she approaches him, grabs him by his garment, um, jacket, robe, the text is a little vague, grabs him by his garment and says, "Lie with me." And if any of you have ever been chasing a child, I know I was with my nephews a few weeks ago, and the younger one, we were playing tag, and I grabbed the hood of his zip-up sweatshirt, and he kept running because it slipped right off of him. Um, that's exactly what happens here, right? She grabs his garment, and he gets away and flees. When she saw that he had left it in her hand and fled outside, she realizes what is in her hand. It's something of Joseph's that she now had. Like this is her golden ticket. She called out to her servants and said to them, "Look, he had to bring us a Hebrew to dally with us. This one came to lie with me, but I screamed loud. And when he heard me screaming at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and got away and fled outside." She kept his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought into our house came to me to dally with me. But when I screamed at the top of my voice, he left his garment with me and fled outside." When his master heard the story that his wife told him, namely, "Thus and so your slave did to me," he was furious. So Joseph's master had him put in prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. Pause there. Ignore the "but even when he was there in prison." So what just happened? What happens after Joseph flees? She framed him. Yeah, exactly. It becomes very quickly a she said, he said, but what are we missing there in the she said, he said?
His side of the story?
Yeah, we're missing his side of the story. And this is where we see that Joseph is a slave. He doesn't get to try to explain what happened from his perspective. This is his fault because he is the slave. She is the wife of the master. And any feelings he has, too bad. But we see this silence from Joseph after he actively spoke, right? He had a voice. And then after the sexual encounter, he loses his voice and he loses his ability to speak and share his opinion. So, what just happened in this text? Joseph explicitly says no. He is a highly vulnerable slave in Egypt. There are no known witnesses. We have the repetition of Joseph's garment, right, referring back to the garment that was given to him by his father. And while he has a voice, he then loses it and is unable to counter Potiphar's wife's accusations. And so yeah, Emmett, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. But Emmett, please.
So the argument that I've seen on the sort of social awkward, not understanding social situation side of this particular encounter is Joseph should have known not to be in the house when only his master's wife was there, particularly after she had been saying, lie with me before. And so the argument that I've seen is that this demonstrates that Joseph doesn't fully understand the social dynamics at play, maybe doesn't understand that she is trying to get with him or that she might act on that without his permission. And that indicates, I mean, and it's part of a longer argument that Joseph is autistic. Obviously, it's not just this incident. But since you were asking about that, that's sort of where that argument comes from. This particular piece of it is honestly one of the less compelling to me pieces of the argument that Joseph is autistic. I think the fact that he's kind of a butthead to his brothers multiple times in a row after they are clearly upset at him is a much stronger argument. But I do see the like you said, right? Like it doesn't really make sense that he's going into the house when no one else is there, particularly given that he might be put in a compromising situation like this. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I've seen a lot of text about why he was there. And interestingly, the rabbinic commentaries that I've read on it have looked at it from a he should have known better, not the was there something, was there a chemical imbalance to suggest what his behavior was doing. And I agree, though, that I think his behavior earlier in his narrative feels like a more compelling argument. But I think that
Yeah,
we also
in light
see
of
that
that, I think this can be a piece of it where we can say,
absolutely.
okay, given that he is so clueless with his brothers, is it possible that that is contributing to why maybe he doesn't realize that this is a bad idea? So playing, the rabbis are, I think, still in line with this argument. They're just not asking why doesn't he know better. They're just saying he should know better.
Yeah,
Anyways, that's all.
absolutely. No, I think very interesting. And I've seen also a lot about wondering about the sexuality of Joseph, and if that also plays a part in it. Um, Joseph is a very complicated character in many ways. And I think what Emmett is sharing about the arguments for how we could understand Joseph to be autistic play into that as well. Um, yeah, I'm just skimming the chat quickly. Potiphar is enraged because even though he's obviously neglecting his wife's needs, how dare his slave do the same? It's very interesting. Um, and Danny, you bring up a good question. Are her servants not there? Maybe he thought they would be enough as he himself is a slave, and maybe knows he wouldn't have to let someone else wouldn't let someone else hurt him, someone in his presence. Um, and there's also the question of she calls out to her slaves, right? So people were around, it seems, right? She yells out and then waits for her husband to get home. So lots of complicated questions here. Um, we're gonna move on to our next two characters. If you are following along on the PowerPoint on your own, we're gonna skip the next two slides, um, just so you are prepared. Um, so what do we know about Dina? She is the first one that many of us thought of when it comes to sexual assault in our texts. She was raped, Lara says. What else? What do we know about her family? Who her parents were? She is not a midwife. She is the only daughter of Jacob. Her brothers took retribution. Mhm. Totally fine. Totally fine. It's late. We're all working, doing the best with our memories. So we're gonna see how this story unfolds a little bit. Dinah is the only daughter of Jacob's 13 children, 12 sons, one daughter. Not sure how to connect these dots, but her Hebrew name is Din Hashem, Judgment of God. Yeah, interesting. So we are in Genesis 34. So we're going back in time a little bit. And we have Dinah. Dinah, the daughter that Leah bore to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. So keep in mind, this is a girl who grew up around 12 brothers. And she is her mother, and then she has three aunts. Right? So Leah, Rachel, um, Bilhah, and Zilpah are the nope. I just misspoke and now I can't remember their names. So I apologize. We're doing our best. So Dinah goes out to see the daughters of the land. They have just settled following Jacob and Esau's reuniting. And she meets Shechem. Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, chief of the country, saw her, took her, and lay with her, and disgraced her. Being strongly drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and in love with the maiden, he spoke to the maiden tenderly. Okay, got a lot here in just 3 verses. And we're not going to read the entire rest of the slide, but Shechem then goes to his father and says, "Get me this girl as a wife." Jacob hears that his daughter has been defiled, and Jacob stays silent until the brothers get home. Then there's a conversation between the fathers, and the sons of Jacob say, "This is unacceptable." There's a lot of back and forth. Note that Dinah is not involved in these conversations. Absolutely not. And so when we get to verse 8, Hamor spoke with them, saying, "My son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves." So they're like, this is a good deal. So Emmett asks, do we ever hear how Dinah hears about Shechem? And Susan asks, does she see Shechem or does he see her? Great questions. So we know that how she feels about Shechem. We're gonna get to that, Emmett. Great question. So we see that Dinah is going out to see the daughters of the land. We don't really know what that means. Is she going to spy and like in a young girl way and see what she can find? Is she hoping to go make new friends? And what does it mean to go out to see the daughters of the land? Right? Is she going into the fields? Is she going towards the city that is nearby? Right? We don't know. There's a lot unclear here. And the answer, Susan, to your question of does she see him or does he see her, is that he sees her, right? So everything from verse 2 onwards happens to her. She is not the one doing the verb. And we're going to take a look at that on our next slide. So this is where we get into some of the translation challenges. And here we have 4 different translations to verses 2 and 3. And so the first one is our original Hebrew text, or original Masoretic text, I should say. And then the first English one is the one we just read from the JPS Tanakh. The second English one, Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the local prince, saw her. He took her and lay her down and raped her. He was then captivated by Jacob's daughter Dinah, and, falling in love with the young woman, spoke tenderly to the young woman. Okay, and that's from the Torah, a women's commentary. Our next one, and Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the land, saw her and took her and lay with her and abused her. And his very self clung to Dinah, daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman, and he spoke to the young woman's heart. That translation is by Robert Alter. And then the way I translated it, Shechem, son of Hamor the Hivite, the head of the land, saw her, Dinah, and took her and humiliated her. His being clung to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he fell in love with the young woman, and he spoke to the young woman's heart. So we get into a lot of the details here of the text, and how we define and how we translate. And so I was just going to point out, Susan says all 4 texts use the verb love, but it's lust, not love. And I think that is really interesting, and begs the question of translation, right? One of the things that I personally have always been challenged by in modern Hebrew is that there is no word for like. The root for like is the same word and root that you use for love. And we see that here in this text, that we don't have a distinction between lust and love. It's just love. And we don't see anything about how she feels towards him, right? This is all him towards her. And so we're going to very briefly look at this last part of this text, where the too long didn't read version of this is that the brothers make a deal with Shechem and his family that all of the men in their village will be circumcised, and then they will be able to marry their daughters. On the 3rd day, when they were in pain, Shimon and Levi, 2 of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, took each his sword, came upon the city unmolested, and slew all the males. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went away. And this is the moment where we see Dinah come back into the conversation, but she is brought back in. She doesn't bring herself in. Right? And so they are named as brothers of Dinah doing this awful thing. And then she is taken out of Shechem's house. And that's the last time we hear of her. A couple verses later, we see the brothers saying to their father, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" But we don't see her ever again, and her story ends. Emmett found something from BDB, translating the Yeah. So on our next slide, you'll see Vayishkav ota ve'enaha, which is a phrase that appears again in the story of Tamar that we will look at briefly. And this verb has so much built into it. There's so little really known about what it is. It can be disgraced, it can be afflicted, it has also been used as rape or humiliated, disgruntled. There's so many words for it, which makes translating really difficult. And also really fun if you are into that. Um, so um, it's complicated, right? It it isn't the same he said, she said. It's we're not even 100% sure what this text is trying to say. And so when we think about that, and then we also realize that Dina doesn't speak at all. She is completely silenced, and there's confusion in the meaning of the text. Um, and there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of scholarship on it. Yeah, Emmett.
Sorry, just a quick question. I'm used to biblical text using yada, like to know, as a euphemism for to have sex with. Um, is this verb used exclusively in cases where there is not consent? And yada is used in cases where at least the biblical text believes there is consent? Is that correct?
Good question, and I want to really appreciate how you asked that question, um, with where the biblical texts believes that there is
Yeah.
consent, um, because that is accurate.
Okay.
That the verb to know is used as that euphemism for sex in, I would say, more sex positive encounters.
I mean,
Um,
I believe it's also used of all of the handmaidens, which again
yes,
is a very problematic quote unquote consent situation.
exactly.
But okay, thank you. That was the information I needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, Susan.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the only midrash that we have uh, or view that we have is also male.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's a lot of it that actually disgraces her further.
Yeah. Beyond what happens to her physically, right? The uh actions her brothers take, so on her behalf, absolutely disgraces her further. Yeah. Hannah?
Um, there's a book called What Dina Knew, a novel, an imagined kind of midrash on Dina's version of the story. It's a good read by Dina Metzger. If you're in Southern California, you may know her. And it takes well, I think I got it from reading that midrashic novel, that since it's all from the male point of view and the brothers, that the book presumes actually that she is in love with the person she had sex with, but because I think I don't know if we know, I can't remember, or it's some hint or suggest that the person was outside of the tribe, and so it's just kind of that is the disgrace, and the brothers liken it or you make it akin to rape, or that a woman couldn't possibly have agency or choice or want to have sex with somebody not approved or chosen by the elders. So that's all I wanted to say, is that from that perspective, we don't actually know if it was rape in the sense of non-consensual sex or just their way of closer to their rage, but that the rage had to do with him being that it was her choice and not a chosen mate.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just catching up on things in the chat. Um, and Josh, I apologize, I missed your comment earlier about the Israelite line being passed down through the father at that time. Um, because if it was through the mother, would the response have been different? Um, that's a really great question, right? How would things play out differently if the mother was the carrier of religion, which we know that she was not, especially based on all of the handmaidens that many of the patriarchs lay with. Um, but Josh, to answer your question about the word, if it could possibly mean, and he answered her, the root is very similar, but this construction with Vaishkav Ota appears um, in the story of Tamar, which we're unfortunately not going to have time to look at, in the same exact way. And so it is those two in conjunction with each other that in this setup, it is believed that it is not about answering. But good question. Um, so with our last 5 minutes, like I said, we're unfortunately not going to have time to dive into the story of Tamar from 2 Samuel, but I will put the link to the source sheet in the chat one more time. And I will also put a link to the slideshow so you can take a read. And I would love to just share briefly 2 quick slides of the modern midrash that I wrote to give a little bit of personal narrative to these stories. And I hope you'll indulge me in being a little bit sassy because I think that Dina has a little bit of a chip on her shoulder that makes her a little bit sassy. I have to hand it to Anita Diamond. She really put my story on the map. She said it well. I became a footnote. My story, a brief detour between the well-known history of my father, Jacob, and the celebrated chronicle of Joseph, my brother. On those rare occasions when I was remembered, it was as a victim. I was sandwiched in between everything else happening around me. The only daughter, my father didn't pay much attention to me, and my mother and aunts saw me as simply another set of hands. I didn't get to hang out with many kids my own age, and no one really cared where I was or what I thought. In the biblical text, my name is mentioned a quick 8 times, and I'm never given the chance to speak. It's often assumed that I didn't have a voice just because I was just a girl. They called me Na'ar and Yalda, talking around me and for me, but never directly to me. No one ever cared to ask how I felt about the entire situation. You want to know if I loved Shechem? What does it matter? My brothers sure didn't stop to care before they deceived Shechem, his father, and their entire city. Their only care was ravaging the city beyond repair. They just used me to justify their actions. And what's worse, in the same verse that tells of Shimon and Levi entering the town, the text has the nerve to remind everyone that they were not only Jacob's sons, but that they were brothers of Dinah. People tend to think that my brothers were well-intentioned with their so-called revenge, but I was already hurt and humiliated. Don't loop me in with their bad choices. I sure didn't ask for them to go and make it 10 times worse. To those of you who might say, oh, what was she wearing? Was she asking for it? I say, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. We had just arrived at our new home, a little plot of land right outside the city of Shechem. I snuck out to explore the area, maybe even find other girls my own age. I had never really had any friends my own age, besides some of my brothers, but they were treated differently and I was always excluded. So I went out to try and make some friends and met a man named Shechem. I didn't really know how to talk to someone outside my family, much less a man from outside my family. He was nice to me. At least, I think he was. In all honesty, I'm not sure what happened. Everyone around me assumed he did things to me that I didn't want, but I don't know what I'm supposed to think. As soon as everyone started freaking out, it was like I was coached into telling a story I didn't fully understand. I got confused with what my brothers were saying. They didn't even ask for my side of the story. And at this point, it's been so long that I don't really remember the order of events. What I do know is that my voice was erased from the biblical text, and my story slipped in between the stories of my fathers. I am a victim of my brother's actions, a victim of blame for the murder of a whole city, and a victim of my consent being taken away from me. Whether that is consent for sexual activity or consent for telling my story, I don't know that we'll ever really know. And so with that, I want to leave you with resources. If you or anyone you know is experiencing sexual violence, there are lots of resources available and lots of clergy in your communities and my community who are here to support you as we grapple with the unfortunate reality that many people face. There is my email if any of you have any further questions. And I know it is 3 a.m. I am so impressed with you all powering through. It is not easily accessible online, but if you email me, I'm happy to send you a write-up of it. The Victim Rights Law Center, yes, is free legal aid for sexual assault survivors. Absolutely. So I am putting it in the chat as we speak. But I wish you all a meaningful rest of your Shavuot learning. And I will pass it over to Roberta, I think.
Yes, thank you, Yael, and thank you everyone for your awesome participation.